It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Eric Hanushek.
Thanks. So this is an organization of the dinner that I actively pushed, that unless you listen to me, you don't get the brownie dessert. So I've got what I consider a good captive audience.
The doors are closed.
So I probably violated most rules by having a handout over dinner. But we'll get to them because there's some pictures in there that I wanted to show you. I've been to Kansas several times before, and at least once with Dave, and other times that I was here to testify in the Montoy School of Finance case and in the Gannon School of Finance case. I did not ghostwrite the Supreme Court decisions on these. They're slightly different than what I would choose. I'm an economist and have studied education policy for a long time and have ended up testifying in a large number of these school of finance court cases, which have swept the nation and have not been good for education policy, in my opinion. But there's some historic cases that I would point out that get a lot of attention. Whoops, they're violating my rule. They're going to give you your dessert without listening. The first school finance court case was Serrano versus Priest in the end of the 1960s. That was the court case that established that state courts should look at school finance issues under the state constitution. It was a court case that originally held the record for being 22 years in the courts, back and forth in the courts. Soon after that, there was a case in New Jersey, which is called Abbott versus Burke now. If you've been watching Kansas, you know that there's the Gannon 5 decision, the 5th decision on the Gannon court case. New Jersey and the Abbott just had Abbott 22, and they have been in the courts since the early 1970s and are still in the courts. So they're very famous. A third court case that I would point out is Kentucky, which is called Rose versus something. And Rose is important because that's become institutionalized in the Kansas Supreme Court decisions. And it looks to me like Kansas is going to get into this hierarchy of court cases that are important nationally, because Kansas has the possibility of keeping a court case going for a long time, for decades. It has the added possibility that these other court cases have not had of being a really good, legitimate constitutional crisis, where the legislature and the courts reach some fundamental impasse. And at that point, state constitutions and the US Constitution don't have many outs. There's not an obvious way that you get out of it if everybody doesn't play the game. And so that's how I come into this. In your handout, what I was going to start with in your handout was that talk a little bit about schools and the economics of schools and the finance of schools. The first thing that I want to say, which is much against the way the courts are talking about in the legislature, is, in my opinion, school finance is education policy. What we see in the courts and what we see in the legislature is sort of a view that you can bifurcate finance issues from policy issues. So we have a finance system that just determines how much money you get, and then we have policies that determine something about how it's used. I think that that's the wrong way to think about it, because many of our decisions on how we finance schools have real policy implications and really do affect what schools are doing. Second major point that I'll just keep coming back to is if you're really interested in student achievement, you have to focus on student achievement. You don't focus on things that you think might be related to school achievement. You focus on student achievement. Thirdly, I've been doing a bit of work recently, both internationally and across US states, that suggests that education is really economically very important. It's important for individuals, but more than that, it's important for states and nations. Now, all of you nod your heads and say, well, why are you wasting our time? We all believe that education is, in fact, economically important. And what I'm hoping to do is convince you by the end of tonight that you've all underestimated how important education is, and that it's much more important than you think. And I'll try to give you some answers for that in Kentucky. The fourth major thing that I'll sort of hit on is how do we change the performance of schools? What's important in terms of student achievement? There is one answer, and that is teachers are the most important element of schools. An effective teacher is essential to having a good school, and an ineffective teacher is very harmful. And that past that, all the details are about how do you ensure that there are effective teachers in your schools. Fifthly, I think it's five, is that you cannot effectively regulate what schools do from the state capitol. It's really hard to write the regulations that determine how education is conducted. And that in part leads into a statement that I'm going to make about 3 or 4 or 5 times tonight, and that is how money is spent is much more important than how much is spent. That is the subject of conflict with the current Kansas Supreme Court, and I think that also the legislature has not paid enough attention to that also. And then I'll pick up a little bit about talking about the current battle in the courts, but largely from questions that you might have on that. So, let me talk a little bit about the payoff to having good schools. I've been doing some work on why some states have grown faster economically than other states and why some states are richer than other states. And over the long run, you come down to almost a single answer, and that is the only thing that matters is the skills of the population. And in that, the schools of the state have an important role. Now, all states, there's lots of migration across states, and there are lots of immigrants from abroad and so forth. But the majority of the labor force of any state is made up of people educated in that state. And so in many ways, you are responsible for your future in that the quality of the schools in Kansas will have a huge impact on the way Kansas develops in the future. Now, one way, I think this is the next picture in your handout, which is a small graph that is probably dim enough here that you can't really read it. What this graph is on the horizontal axis is essentially the test scores of the adult population. What are the skills of the adult population of each state? And the vertical axis is the long-run economic growth rate. And what all those little marks on there are individual states. And you see the arrow is picking out Kansas, which is right in the middle in terms of what the labor force looks like and what the economic growth rate has been in Kansas. And the upward sloping line suggests if the schools got better in Kansas, you could legitimately expect the growth, economic growth in Kansas to pick up. If the
Can we
schools,
ask questions as we go?
Yeah, no, that would be-
Are those test scores from high school, or those test scores as, you said as adults, I think?
yeah. What's behind this is that these are measures of the test scores that we have now of high school, basically high school or intermediate school, but they are for where the people were educated. So about half, a little over half of the adults, working adults in Kansas were educated in Kansas. And the remainder were educated in either other states or abroad. And so what we've tried to do is trace back where were all the adults in Kansas educated in the past and assign them the average performance of the state or country where they were educated. And what this is our attempts to measure what the test scores, if we went out and actually tested all a sample of adults in Kansas would look like, or each of the states. Yes?
What test measure did you use? Is that
We're largely using the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, which is the consistent measure of school performance. It started in 1970, roughly, and now we have individual state comparisons. In fact, if you, I don't know where it is on your handout, maybe it's the next, the blue line diagram there is the ranking of all the states in the nation according to 8th grade mathematics. So somewhere in the middle is the national average in the sort of green dotted thing in the middle of those blue lines. And the red dashed line is where Kansas falls. So Kansas, in terms of 8th grade mathematics performance today, and it's also been fairly consistent as far as we've measured in the past, is above average for the nation, but it's also noticeably behind what other states are doing, what Massachusetts is doing, what Minnesota is doing. You find that the average 8th grader in Kansas today is at about the 36th percentile of Massachusetts distribution of performance. So
You don't have to worry about so many taxes.
no, you've got it just backwards, actually. And so the story is, what would happen if, for example, the average Kansas kid rose to the level of Massachusetts today? And so if you take the line that I showed you about economic growth and just sort of project into the future, what would happen? It takes a while before you get new industries and you get new growth and so forth. But over the long run, the growth in Kansas would increase noticeably, so that over the long run, the average income per capita in Kansas would be something like 7% higher than it is with no improvement. So think of today's schools, and if you could improve them, on average, you would get a 7% rise in each and every worker's salary for the next 80 years, actually. And there's some little manipulations behind the scene in that, but that's basically saying, all of you worried about the taxes, well, you can completely cover all of the current state taxes in Kansas with the growth dividend. This would be large enough to pay for the entire set of governmental services in Kansas if, in fact, the quality of the schools could increase to the level of Massachusetts. And why is Massachusetts interesting? Well, it's a state that's actually done it. I mean, is Massachusetts that different than Kansas? It's a state that's actually been shown that it's possible. So it shows what can be done.
Was there other variables besides test scores that were factored into the relationship?
So the only other thing that's in there, in reality, is the starting income level. These are long-run growth rates. They're 1970 to 2010. And it includes where did each state start in 1970. And that's important because if you start behind, what do you have to do? Well, you just have to copy what everybody else is doing. And it's easier to grow faster if you start behind because you're just copying. If you start ahead, you have to invent new processes and do new things, and that's harder. It also takes into account the years of school completed in each state, but it turns out that provides no additional information here. And the point is that if you just sit in a class and don't learn anything, it doesn't count. It has no impact. The only thing that counts of going to school is how much you learned, and we're measuring that with the test scores. Yes?
Is that 7% related to certain vocations or everyone's vocation?
It's related to everything. It's on average. Everybody who works in Kansas, on average, would have 7% more paycheck each and every year for the next 80 years.
But it would affect more certain vocations than others, right?
Oh, no, there'd be a distribution, yeah. Sure. And that's one of the stories that we can come back to it. I mean, one of the stories today is what does education do for you? Well, it gives you the ability to adjust to a changed environment so that we look at Detroit and we've got a bunch of unemployed auto workers today. What are they? They're people that couldn't adjust to the fact that we no longer make cars with monkey wrenches and screwdrivers, but we use automated things, and they were left behind. And one of the things that is behind this is that the people who are going to come out ahead are the ones that adjust to a changed economy, to new production processes, new ideas, new ways of doing things. Yes?
Dr. Hanushek, so is education the engine that drives the economy, and aren't there partners and collaborators in that industry, entrepreneurs, and what's their relationship with education?
Education is the engine, in my opinion, and what about the companies? The companies come and use the resources they have, and they do the things, they use the skills that they can find.
So they
and
recognize and appreciate.
Companies appreciate it, and they will, in part, adjust how they produce things to the skills of their labor force, and in part, they will adjust where they locate plants based upon the skills of the people that they can find. So I view them as the producers, but they produce because of, they produce different amounts based upon the skills they have. So I can go on to talk about this. This is getting up to Massachusetts. It turns out that we don't just compete with Massachusetts. We compete internationally now in so many areas. And Kansas falls somewhere ahead of Portugal and behind Poland right now. And if the future is going to be different, we have to move ahead of that ranking to out of Southern Europe to other places in East Asia or Northern Europe that are, in fact, ahead. Now, how do we do this? Let me come back. We're starting to get, again, closer to discussions of school finance and so on, which is what Dave asked me to talk about a bit, and we'll get there. The next sort of chart that you should have is the sort of explanation of, or backdrop of data related to the statement I gave that says how money is spent is much more important than how much. Now what this is a plot is on the horizontal axis is how much has expenditures per pupil, adjusted for inflation, increased over a 20-year period. It should be 1990 to 2010. And the vertical axis is how much did test scores on these National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP tests, increase over that time. And that's the one test that we have where we can compare all states because everybody takes the same test. And what do you see? Well, the red line is what would happen if I just draw the statistical line through there, and it's perfectly flat. It says just putting more money into the schools does not guarantee that student performance will go up.
I'm sorry, this is the change in spending, not the absolute level.
It's the change in spending.
So what about the correlation of absolute spending adjusted for cost of living in the area versus outcome?
You don't get any better answer.
It's the same.
It's the same. What I was trying to do is get rid of all the other things, though, by looking at the change, to try to get rid of lots of the other things that are around by just looking at differences. So, and this sort of answers the question, what would happen if the state legislature exceeded what the state Supreme Court said should be spent in Kansas and put a lot of money into it? Well, we wouldn't know. You might get the answer if you look on the far right-hand side. You see New York State and you see Wyoming, which are two states that have been run by school court cases in which they've spent an enormous amount of money and got just the average results out of it. If you look in the top left-hand corner, you'll see Florida, which has essentially not spent a dime more in the last 20 years on its schools in real terms, inflation adjusted, and they've been the third fastest growing state in terms of performance, achievement. And you see everybody scattered all over. Now, if you look very hard, you will not find Kansas on this test, on this picture. And the reason is that Kansas didn't start participating in the NAEP test until 2002 or 2003, so that we don't have the whole historical data. There's only 41 states or something that participated entirely along that period, and Kansas wasn't one of them. So you can put in Kansas any place you want. We have no data to disprove it.
Just real quickly, so the states presumably spend different amounts of money per student on the average,
Yep.
so that the percent increase wouldn't change this chart?
No. This is just one way of saying that there is no consistent relationship between the amount of money spent on schools and the outcomes in terms of student achievement. That's the one thing that we have over long periods of time. It's been subject to huge academic fights, but that's the simple story, is that there's no consistent relationship between what's spent on schools and the outcomes. Sometimes schools spend more money and get lots of good output, and sometimes they don't.
Did you run a correlation coefficient on this data?
Yeah, it's zero.
It's zero, right. That's what it looks like a totally random.
No, it's zero. I mean, the flat line says it's zero. It sort of says, the flat line says, what would I predict if I chose to increase spending by $3,000 per student? And you look up on the line and you find I would predict exactly the same that I would predict if you spent $6,000 more, or if I spent no more. It's a flat line. You know, my prediction is always the same. Nothing. So if increasing the money isn't the answer, what is? And I've already told you the answer. The answer is really having effective teachers. There has now been extensive amounts of investigations across all kinds of different schools in the U.S., different grade levels, different measures of student performance. And they point to the one systematic difference is some teachers teach better than others. And it makes a big difference. Now, the ones that teach better than others aren't necessarily the ones that have master's degrees or more experience or all of the certificates that are handed out in states, or it went to the right teacher training school or didn't go to the right teacher training. There's basically nothing systematic that has been discovered in terms of the major kinds of policy discussions that we often have about teachers. It's unrelated to effectiveness. Yes?
How is Florida spending their money? They haven't increased spending, but their results are.
Well,
So to look at your chart, how the money is spent, what are they doing?
so it's hard to identify exactly what each state is doing. They're doing a combination of things. I always attribute what Florida did over this period to Jeb Bush. And Jeb Bush, when he was governor, basically every piece of Florida paper, stationery and so on, had Florida Reads written on it. And it probably, people had all kinds of mistakes because it was written over with Florida Reads and stuff. But he emphasized we're going to do better with reading. He tested students. He tried new policies and found out whether the tests went up or down when he put in new policies. He instituted grading systems for schools that Dave has been pushing some here of A through F grading of schools. And if you were an F school, 2 years in a row, the students had the right to go to any private school, public or private school in the state. A whole variety of accountability, pressures on who can get teaching certificates, et cetera.
Bottom line is, it was all about accountability.
I'll throw out my theory is that a lot of those kids probably went to private school. I was in Tampa a couple of years ago, accrediting a school, as it were. And those kids come, they have the money to go to private school provided by the state. And I don't know what the percentage of kids in private school are in Florida, but I think it would have some impact on that.
It has some impact, but that's not driving it. Frankly, it's not large enough to drive it, and so that may be important. So to give you some idea of the impact of teachers, I have a couple of graphs. One is, this is the night for complicated graphs, so if you had more than one glass of wine beforehand, just forget it. But for those of you who didn't have more than one glass of wine, let me tell you what this picture is. What we know is a lot about how different teachers are. So we know how a 75th percentile teacher compares to a 50th percentile teacher, an average teacher, in terms of how much achievement gain you can expect for that teacher. And that's pretty well known. And so what this picture is to try to say, well, if a student in 6th grade gets higher achievement, what would that have to do with that student's income in the future? We also know that people who have higher achievement, higher NAEP scores or whatever, SAT scores, earn more on average in the labor market. And this just puts together the idea that a good teacher raises the achievement of her class, and that achievement is paid off in the future. What this picture tries to do is to show how much does it pay off for that class. And so it's going to depend upon how many kids the teacher treats, how many kids are in the class of the teacher. So that's why there's, on the horizontal axis is class size or the number of students. But what this says is a 75th percentile teacher, who's a pretty good teacher, ahead of all but 25, a quarter of the other teachers. A 75th percentile teacher will create $430,000 of added income over the lifetime of her class of 30 kids, compared to an average teacher. Each year. 1 year, compared to an average teacher, that 75th percentile teacher, according to what we know about the labor market and her impact on the class, creates $430,000 of added income for her class each year. So obviously then, if we go to the next page, by the way, there's a bottom.
Is that done with handheld data that tracks people over longer periods of time of how you got the performance?
No, these are putting it together. These aren't tracking exactly the kids in each class. We know how much achievement is raised by a 75th percentile teacher, and we also know in the labor market how much that achievement is paid. What's the payoff to that achievement? And so it's projecting out what we know about the labor market. Now, one of my colleagues at Stanford, Raj Chetty, actually did what you're talking about. He went into New York City, or he didn't go into New York City schools. He had the data from New York City schools in the 1990s about how different teachers were in terms of their achievement, what they did to achievement. And he matched kids in their elementary school classes to their IRS income tax returns. So he actually knows what they were earning from the IRS out in the labor market. And you get very similar answers to this, that teachers that bump up achievement for their kids, it shows up when you go out to the IRS and see what the people are putting on their 1040s.
Dave, can you get that study?
Sure.
That's
yeah.
so powerful.
Dr. Hanushek, how can you determine that the results are entirely dependent on the effectiveness of the teacher? And also, what is your definition of an effective teacher?
So this is a projection made by first a lot of detailed, careful studies to try to isolate the impact of the teacher on achievement, independent of parents and other kids in the school and other characteristics. And that is now pretty well known, how much difference there is between good and bad teachers. You can isolate the impact of teachers. There's also pretty good work in the labor market to isolate the impact of different achievement levels on earnings. And what this projection does is just put those two things together. What the study by my colleague Chetty did was to take estimates of the impact of teachers that are, again, independent of other factors and actually link them to their ultimate wages and looked at, those that had higher achievement on average had higher wages, and he could estimate how much higher.
So that's the definition of an effective teacher.
Yeah, that's the one I'm using. The one I'm using here is an effective teacher is one who gets large amounts of learning gains out of students. So it's all based upon, if you look at all the fifth grade teachers in Kansas, and you pay attention to where the students with each teacher were in the fourth grade, and you look at where do they end up at the end of fifth grade. And it turns out that there are huge differences across classrooms in that. Some teachers, the kids with some teachers, after you take into account their fourth grade scores, get huge fifth grade scores, and others get small. So one study I did in actually Gary, Indiana, it was an all poverty school district, all black kids in this school district, and the difference between a top teacher and a bottom teacher was 1 full year of study each academic year. So that a top teacher got 1.5 grade levels gain in achievement of her students. A bottom teacher got half a year gain in grade level equivalents of her kids. And so the difference, depending upon what classroom you were assigned to, was a full academic year's worth of knowledge each academic year. So that's what's behind this, is that the difference between highly effective and highly ineffective teachers is huge.
But then you have to correlate the kids, you have to separate out the kids that had those teachers.
Yeah.
You have to track that somehow. That seems like it's like crazy.
No, that is crazy, but that's what you get.
So you're demonstrating the importance of the effectiveness of the teacher
Yeah.
on the outcomes
Right.
of the
Right.
student's potential.
Correct.
What are they doing? It's different.
What are they doing? They're teaching. That's what we know. That we don't. My simple summary statement is that teaching is one of the most complicated activities that we know about, and researchers have been unable to really describe differences among teachers. You can tell the difference. I mean, and
You can demonstrate it.
you can demonstrate it, and I don't know if Eric is going to agree with me on this or not. There was a study and done of videotaping a group of teachers in their performance. And then these videotapes, people were given 15-second sites of individual teachers in different classrooms with no sound on, and were told to rank the teachers. And it turns out that they ranked very highly correlated with measures of what the kids learned over the year, that you could almost immediately tell the difference between an effective and an ineffective teacher, which is something different than saying I can describe what are the characteristics or the background or the mannerisms of an effective teacher.
So something to do with the interaction between the
It's-
teacher and the student.
Yeah. It's, what I'm trying to say is I don't know the answer to that. I think it is, but I mean, like, what am I? Think back of your really good teachers that you had. Do you think of a few individuals? Think of 2 or 3 individuals that you had that were really good. So when I do that, one of them obviously just hated kids. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. But is in the top 3. And then there's others that are warm and cuddly, and there are others that have great subject matter knowledge, and others that don't have such good subject matter knowledge but are able to transmit things. And so we don't have the descriptions of these characteristics, which is really important when we think about policy.
Doctor, is there a correlation, a market-based correlation where the students just rank the teachers, and a correlation between their assessment and actually how good they are at teaching the kids to learn? I mean, sure. I mean, has there been studies like that?
There are studies like that. And in fact, I'm going to just mention right at the very end here, there's a change in the way teachers are evaluated and paid and retained in Dallas, Texas, that in part bases the teacher's evaluation on student surveys, and in part based it on changes in test scores, and in part does it based upon principal evaluations. But there is an attempt to use that information, and there's been a couple studies. It's not clear exactly how to do these studies, because some people dismiss the idea of using test scores to measure teacher performance, and others think that that's central to everything and so forth. But in general, they're all correlated, that the students will, in fact, identify the teachers that get the highest gains in learning. Okay, well, look. So let me come back to this now. Lynn, your questions are just right on target, because we can't sit in the state capitol and write the regulations for what the ideal teacher looks like if we don't know what the ideal teacher looks like. So it's very hard to sit there and describe exactly what preparation teachers should have, what certifications they should have, and it's very difficult to just pay them on the basis of some characteristics, like having a master's degree or having more experience. It's hard to do that if, in fact, those aren't related to the effectiveness of the teacher in the classroom.
Precisely.
I just wanted to mention first I think that I mentioned the Dallas example, and I won't go into detail because I'm going on a little bit too long. But what Dallas did was to dramatically change the way it pays, evaluates and pays both principals and teachers, to take into account student performance and other evaluations. They did away with the standard salary schedule based upon experience and degree levels, and substituted a salary schedule based entirely on effectiveness, measured effectiveness. And then they got worried about the following. They got worried that, well, maybe teaching in a very disadvantaged schools harms you, that it's harder to get the same rating. And on top of that, it's hard to get many teachers to want to go into the most disadvantaged schools. So what they did was start paying teachers and principals a bonus for going into the most disadvantaged schools, but based upon effectiveness. There are many examples in the US of school systems that put in combat pay, extra pay for going into disadvantaged schools, but they don't distinguish about anything about the effectiveness of teachers. And on average, combat pay has not done anything. There's an underlying economic theorem. I'll teach you an economic theorem while we're here. The economic theorem is that bad teachers like more money as much as good teachers. So if you just put out a bonus, you find that you get some bad teachers and some good teachers taking the bonus, but on average, performance doesn't change. Well, Dallas gave out $10,000 bonus for the top-ranked teachers who would go into the most disadvantaged schools in their district, $8,000 for a good but not as good teacher, and $6,000 in the middle. And yes, I got it here. So the bottom figure on the same one, the top thing I skipped over. There's a red line of teacher effectiveness for a 10th percentile teacher on the top that I should mention. A 10th percentile teacher is subtracting $800,000 a year in future income from her class of 30 compared to an average teacher. So that there are real costs to not paying attention to the effectiveness of teachers.
That's over a lifetime, right?
That's
$800,000 over a lifetime, not per year, right?
It's per year for the teacher's students, it's over the lifetime of the students. So it's taking the lifetime projections for the students, but it's each and every year for the teacher is doing this. So the bottom line then is just a comparison of this Dallas system, which has just started. It was just instituted in 2015. And the picture I gave you at the bottom there shows different kinds of schools in Dallas on math performance. The very top line up at the top are all the non-disadvantaged schools in Dallas. There's 165 non-disadvantaged schools in Dallas. The line right below that, the dashed line that is that blue, are the more disadvantaged schools based on on students' background of economically disadvantaged students. And the two lines at the bottom, the red one, the bottom black line is the performance in the worst schools in Dallas. They are schools that have the lowest parental income backgrounds and have, over long periods of time, been underperforming, low performing. And the red lines are schools that look almost like those. They're just slightly better, and they didn't get put in this bottom category. And what you see is this program comes into effect in 2015. You get immediately a large proportion of effective teachers into the worst schools, and student performance goes up. That is, in some sense, the lesson that I want to leave you with, and that is people respond to incentives. And if you get the incentives focused on what you care about, student achievement, you get results. That is what is entirely lacking in the current discussions of court cases. So what do I have to say? I'll give you a little quick summary here of what's going on. Kansas had its first court case at the end of the 1990s. The decision, I think, was in 2003 in Montoy, which found that the funding of schools in Kansas was inequitable. And it was inequitable in part because rich districts could raise more money to fund their schools than poor districts, given the local option of paying a higher property tax rate, and was told that that had to be changed. It's also told that the schools weren't spending enough money.
$1 billion.
Pardon?
Just $1 billion.
Yeah, so that's wasn't their first one, was it, in Montoy? That came in Gannon, where we got up to $1 billion. But one of the things that they had, the plaintiffs in this who wanted more money being spent on their schools, was that they had some consultants come in and tell the state how much money was needed in order to provide for a good education. They quantified that.
But they used to work for Sprint, the consultants. Yeah. Oh, I didn't say that.
The court said, look, the state never did its own cost estimate, so that must be right. And that must be the one that's important. Now, think of what they're doing. You saw the picture that I had before that said how money is spent is more important than how much is spent. And you saw the flat line that related increase in spending to achievement. What the court is asking, or what these consultants were doing, is the opposite. They say, if we wanted to increase achievement by some amount, how much do we have to spend? But it's exactly the same problem, right? It's just playing it backwards of how much do we have to spend to get this added achievement. What that picture shows you across states, and it's been duplicated in all kinds of different ways, is that it's impossible to do that problem. Let me take that back. It's impossible to do that on a scientific basis that is defensible. Consultants can do a lot of things, but it's not scientific and it's not defensible. And they have provided estimates of the amount of money that it takes to have a good school system. That came back with Gannon, the Gannon court case, which after all kinds of disagreement that you know better than I, The state had a funding formula, declared that how much was going to be spent in the future, and then we had something called the 2008 recession. Kansas, like almost every other state, cut back on its funding as a result of revenues going down with the recession. That led to a new court case that said, wait a minute, you promised us this much money, and you cut back on that. You can't renege on your deal to provide us that money. And that is, in fact, what is currently under consideration, with the court in Gannon 5 saying, well, you promised this money. We said that the money was going to be okay, but you didn't provide it. We're not going to tell you how much to spend, but if you don't spend X dollars, it won't be constitutional. And that's where it stands, which is a very unfortunate situation in my mind of on the verge of a real constitutional crisis, because the legislature is not as prone to being as large in spending as the courts might think is necessary. To me, the only answer is there's a way out. Whether you can get to it or not, I don't know. The way out is that the legislature takes seriously what are the kinds of policies that will lead to an increased achievement of students, and fund policies that are arguably going to increase achievement, and then having an accountability system that holds people to that. So what I'm talking about is policies that provide incentives for better performance of both teachers and schools. Think of the Dallas kind of system, but where the state encourages schools to do better and rewards schools and teachers that do better with added funds, provides the incentives there. This would provide, in my mind, an argument that you could take to the court and say, look, we don't know exactly how to get higher achievement. That's what we all want. Here's our plan. Go with us for a while, and we'll evaluate it, and we'll let you know how we're doing. We will fund higher performance, was what we want. We will not just fund more school spending to get school spending up. We'll fund performance. Now, whether the legislature or courts in Kansas can get to that position is something that each of you know better than I. But that strikes me as the only feasible way to get out of the current impasse that is being faced in Kansas. Kansas courts had, to me, what is the single craziest line that's ever been made in any of these school funding cases that are around the country. And that says, we don't think that you are providing enough funds to provide a good education for our kids, and if you don't provide enough funds, we're going to close the schools. I mean, this stands out as a singular achievement of logic that is beyond me. So that's what I had to say.
Think about this for a minute. Imagine if we had a legislature that said, okay, hospitals, doctors, hospitals are going to pay your doctors based strictly on how long they've been a doctor. Now, they all went to medical school, so education doesn't count. You get paid based on how long you've been a doctor, not what's your cure rate, not anything, how long you've been a doctor.
Not survival rate.
Not survival rate, how long you've been a doctor. And then you as patients get assigned to go to a hospital in your neighborhood, you can't pick. You get to go to a doctor that's getting paid based on how long he or she has been a doctor. How long would you set for that?
Does it lower my insurance cost?
Of course not.
I was gonna say, it's
But-
a trick question.
That's the system we have for teachers. You know, if you ask the education lobby, how do you define an effective teacher? Oh, you can't do that, it's not fair, you can't do this. Ask a kid, they'll tell you which are the good teachers and bad teachers in the school. Ask a parent, they'll tell you which teachers are good or bad. Ask a teacher, they'll tell you, I don't want kids from that teacher, I want them from this teacher.
Right.
We all know. And yet, and this is one thing perhaps that people on all sides of the education debate can agree on, an effective teacher makes more difference than anything else.
Right.
But we have a legislature, not just in Kansas, but across this country, that says, well, we don't want to go there because that's controversial. And you know, our number one priority is getting reelected, so we can't have that conversation. So we pay teachers, doesn't matter how good they are, doesn't matter what they teach. You teach phys ed, you teach chemistry, you get the same. You've been here 5 years, you get the same. That's why some of the highest paid teachers in Kansas, phys ed teachers. Because they've been doing it for 40 years. That's why. As Eric said, if we want to improve outcomes, maybe the first step is focusing on improving outcomes. Not how much is spent. We can't measure how much we care about education based on how much we spend on it. But that's the political way of thinking. That's one of the big things we're trying to change, is help people understand what we're really focused on. Are these outcomes, is it acceptable that we have 29% of the kids in Kansas who take the ACT are considered college ready? Is it acceptable that less than 30% of kids in 10th grade in Kansas are considered on track for college and career on the state assessment? We're here, I think, in the Blue Valley School District, theoretically the best school district in the state. Half the 10th graders are on track for college and career. Half. Wow. Is that acceptable? I don't think so. What are we going to do about that? Until we decide something isn't acceptable and we start focusing on, that's what we try to do, that's what you help us do. Your support of Kansas Policy Institute helps us go communicate these messages to citizens, to legislators, sometimes even the media if they're willing to listen. This is what's really going on. We can't start solving problems until we understand that we have them. Then we have a responsibility to start taking action that might actually change it, like ensuring that we have effective teachers in every classroom. Not reducing class size. That's one of the, sounds logical, but if a school district has done everything they can to hire effective teachers, what do you do when you hire more to reduce the class size? You're by default going and getting less effective teachers. Start focusing on but that's one of the biggest challenges we face and why it's so important and why we're so appreciative of the support you give us and coming out and listening to one of the world's greatest experts on education economics, understanding what we're really trying to solve. So we'll if we have one or two more questions, we'll take it, but I do want to respect your time and get you out of here. Russ.
Has there been studies on how many effective teachers we lose? I mean, anecdotally, I see teachers leaving because of additional restrictions and regulations in Common Core and kind of a lack of autonomy. Has there been studies on how that's caused us to lose effective teachers over time?
Well, we lose both effective and ineffective teachers. I mean, one of the things about schools is that the working environment is really important to most people, and some of these things affect the working environment. Schools actually have a lower turnover rate than almost every other occupation, teaching. You hear in the public policy debates, we've got to pay more for our teachers because we have such a high turnover rate. Well, it's high in almost all occupations in the US, and teachers aren't different there. What we don't do is concentrate on trying to keep the most effective teachers. I mean, if we refuse to treat an effective teacher differently than an ineffective teacher, we shouldn't expect to keep an undue proportion of effective teachers.
Well, yeah,
So
you're gonna
one- and
affect the
retention-
effective teacher by doing that.
Yeah.
Well, retention could be an
You-
area to work on.
Oh, no, no,
Retention's a big
absolutely.
area, but
Absolutely.
attraction is another big area.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the fact that we pay teachers $30,000 to start, how many people can afford, I mean, how many people do we lose? That's what scares me. How many people don't even consider going into teaching?
Absolutely.
Because I look at the loans I'm gonna have to take out, I can't afford to go do that. I can't make a living. I'd love to be a teacher. We need, if we pay teachers for performance based on effectiveness, if you had the potential to make 6 figures as a beginning teacher, 3-4 years in, you might get a lot more qualified people going into the profession.
Let me add one footnote to that statement, and that is there's also a number of people that don't go into teaching because there is no evaluation and no differentiation. They don't go in because they know if they do particularly well, nothing happens. And there are a lot of people that go into other occupations just because they don't want to be just treated independently of how well they do.
They sell real estate.
Right, or, well, I just looked at the average, Bob might have showed me this, there was something about the average debt of a 4 or 5 year college student versus the starting wage that they make, and the debt was like, call it $100,000, and the average starting wage for a college educated kid was $27,000. I'm thinking, how does that even correlate? I don't get it.
It doesn't, and that's one of the challenges we face. But it's also, if I can get a plug in, Scott, that's one of the reasons that we got a law passed in Kansas. So now, if you go sign up for a college course, you're going to get a prospectus from a college university that says it's going to get this degree, it's going to take you this many years, cost you this much money, and here's the pay you'll get when you graduate.
So
We had to fight like crazy to get that law passed, so at least people are going in, if they're gonna go get a degree in something that's gonna pay $25,000 a year, they're gonna know it going in. They're not gonna be surprised at least. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your attendance tonight. We're honored to have Dr. Hanushek here with us. This is the first of several events we'll do in this region this year. We do several regional events every year. We try to spread them around the state, but we usually do 3 or 4 in the Kansas City area. So again, thank you so much for coming, and drive safely.
Thank you for having me.